Good morning, students. We are to discuss another critic today, and that is Plato. Plato is a second unit in your CC 12 literary criticism. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher and critic. He lived around, say, 424 or 428 BC to 348 BC. Now, surprisingly, he was the student of Socrates and his student was Plato. Socrates was the teacher of Plato and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. So, in this paper, we are going to study teacher and student both. Plato first, and after Plato's discussion, we shall have Aristotle's views. And you know, they both talk about one concept of imitation. Now, imitation it must be a familiar word to you in the sense of jewelry. That which is not real. Real gold is different. And something which looks like gold is another. All right, real pearl is different, but giving you the effect of or the shining like a real pearl, but it is not exactly the real pearl. So that we call imitation. So this concept of imitation, Plato applied to literature and arts as well. So now something must be clear to you that when Plato talks about imitation with reference to literature and art, then he must be saying something which is not real, literature and art being not real. And then comes Aristotle who says that no, even literature and arts are real. So who holds which viewpoint and how, you know, teacher and student debate or they stand as opposite to each other. That is something very interesting. When we shall complete Plato and Aristotle both, you will have a fine view of both holding different views about the theory of imitation. This particular concept or this particular idea, or you may call it philosophy also, that Plato gave is known as Platonic idea or Platonic realism. What did he say in Platonic idea or Platonic realism? He said that universals or abstract objects, they exist outside the human mind. Universal or abstract objects. Say, for instance, the concept of this very gadget which is in your hand, say mobile, say laptop, any furniture item. Plato, to justify, uses the example of a chair. So let's take chair. Let's take the concept of house, idea of house. So all these abstract ideas or objects, they do not exist in the human mind first. They exist outside the human mind. Which means that in the universe, there is some idea called a chair. In the universe, there is some idea called a house, some idea called XYZ gadget, XYZ furniture item, and an inspired, say, carpenter, inspired architect, inspired poet, because we have to relate everything in terms of literature. So, inspired poet, they, you know, receive this idea from the universe. After all, poetry is always a subject of inspiration, no? So, poets always receive the idea, you know, something bestows on them. They are in a different state of mind and that's why they are able to write, right? So, according to Plato, the universal or abstract ideas, they always exist outside the human mind. And which he considers as ideal form. And this particular stance that Plato takes is known as Platonic idealism. This is ideal, that the idea does not exist in human mind, but it is somewhere outside the human brains. It is somewhere outside the human sensibility. And from there, Plato, the poet, receives the idea. So this is the main theory that Plato talks about, uh, idea existing outside the mind, and how various artists, poets, writers, they get inspired. Now, being inspired is not something good according to Plato, right? And he says that this is the reason that because it is not near to realism or capital, it is all false. Plato's main argument in his works is that all literature and all arts are false. And before we proceed in our discussion, Plato gives this theory of theory of imitation and his theory of idealism, Platonic idealism. It is known as in the works like Republic, Ion. They are known as dialogues. They are known as dialogues because he has written his critical treatise in the dialogue form, and that's why Ion and Republic, two chief works by Plato, they are known as dialogues. And in these works, he has propounded his theory of imitation. Right. So, shall we start with the core discussion now? Yeah, so his views on poet and poetry, that is what we are concerned with. And while discussing his views on poet and poetry, he also talks about, we can say his views on poet and poetry are based on his theory of imitation. His theory of imitation is a valuable contribution to the study of art and literature. And his theory of mimesis also means imitation. Mimesis is a Greek word for imitation, and this word was given by Aristotle. But Plato strictly used the word imitation. So when we are discussing Plato's theory, we shall employ the word imitation. And when we are discussing Aristotle, we shall employ the word mimesis. All right, we have to be clear. So Plato's theory of imitation, what does it say? That the art deals with illusion, or they are imitation of an imitation. They deal with illusion. Art is not realistic, because we discussed that Plato's idealism believes that abstract ideas or objects, they exist outside the human mind. They are not in the human purview, human perception. And poet in a different state of mind receives that particular idea from the universe. So art is never realistic. Art is all illusion. It is created in a state of dream, in a state of semi-consciousness, you can say. And that is why Plato thinks that art is illusion, or they are imitation of an imitation, twice removed from reality. Now, how come that art is an imitation of an imitation? First, we say that art is all imitation, it is not real. Now, Plato says that it is an imitation of an imitation, twice removed from reality. How come it is twice removed from reality? Then it is twice removed because, in fact, in our discussion further, Plato will give the example also. But to tell you in brief, say for instance, we have a poem on flower. Then first of all, flower exists somewhere in the universe. The idea of flower, I mean, exists somewhere in the universe, as Plato said. Then the real flower that we see as a form of nature, Mother Nature, right? So that is the physical manifestation. Then painter looks at that real flower and makes a beautiful painting of that flower. Now think, compare the real flower and the painted flower. Are they same? You may say that yes, in size and color and shape, they may be the same. Yes, but then the painted flower lacks the soft touch which the real petals give you. The painted flower lacks the fine fragrance that real flower gives you. And now we come to, so it is once removed from reality, the painting. And now looking at that painting, a poet comes to write a poem on flower. So when a poet writes a poem, you know, he has to describe every tit and bit of the flower. He has to give the minutest details of the flower. So he has to even give the description of the color. He has to give the description of the size of the flower, the soft touch that the petals have. You know, he has to, through words, through the medium of words, the poet has to make the reader feel every little bit, every little part of flower, the beauty that lies in the flower. All right. So that is why poet writing a poem on flower on the basis of the painting is twice removed from reality. He even has to employ words, such words in poetry that make you feel the fragrance of the flower. All right. So in this way, Plato justifies his argument of theory of imitation, and that's why he says all arts are twice removed from reality. Plato was the first who inquired into the nature of imaginative literature and put forward theories which are both illuminating and provocative. Now it is irony also that Plato himself was a poet, though he considered poets as false, poets as thrice removed from reality. So he was poet, and his dialogues are full of poetic beauty or dramatic quality. That I said in my introduction, his two major works, An and Republic, they are written in the dialogues form, and they are poetic dialogues in nature. As a Plato, you know, he believed that art has to be not only aesthetic in nature. Art must have something to teach, something to preach. And artists, now here the word artist also includes the word poet. So artists, he said that they cannot only relax themselves, or they cannot rest themselves by just arousing the aesthetic relish, by just entertaining. All artists have to be the moralist first. You might be aware about the two different schools of art for art's sake and arts for life's sake. Kala ne khatar kala ane જીવન ને ખાતર કલા. આવી બે અલગ schools છે, આવા બે અલગ domains છે in the field of art. And Plato believed that the art which is dedicated to life, that which aims at the betterment of life, is the real art, right? So in that sense, he was more concerned with the moral aspect of art and the artist, right? That is what we have in our next point of discussion. So as a moralist, Plato disapproves of poetry because it is immoral. And as a philosopher, he disapproves of it because it is based on falsehood. Now see here 2 points that Plato rejects poetry actually on 3 grounds, but right now we are discussing the first 2 major grounds that Plato rejects poetry. First, on the ground of moral, second, on the grounds of philosophy. As a moralist also he disapproves because poetry is immoral. It doesn't lay down the ethical values. And another, as a philosopher also he disapproves poetry because it does not establish the truth, T capital, or say it doesn't talk about the universal truth. It all talks about idealism and emotions and imagination, which are temporary, transient, not everlasting. And poetry is based on falsehood. So in that way he rejects poetry. Now, let me read something from your text, an introduction to the making of literature by R.A. Scott James. And R.A. Scott James says, you already have the chapter with you. And on page 37, there is a quotation at the end of page 37. He says it in his work, The Ion. And he says, Plato in the Ion ironically explains the traditional view accepted by the Rhapsodies. Rhapsodies, they are rhetoricians, poets, aestheticians. What does he say? The muse. Muse is the goddess of poetry, Greek goddess of poetry. So the muse, first of all, inspires men herself. Here the men stands for the poet. So muse inspires the poet herself. For all good poets, epic as well as lyrics, compose their beautiful poems not by art, but because they are inspired and possessed. They do not create poetry, whatsoever the form, whether it is lyric, whether it is epic, odd, song, whatever, but they do not compose poetry out of art as an art, out of aesthetic sense, but because they are inspired and possessed by some uh, divine or semi-divine powers, and that's why they are able to write. And when they are, Plato also says that when they are possessed by some divine powers or divine powers, they are moving away from the realities of the world, and there he finds a fault in the poet. And he says that poets are not in their right mind when they are composing their beautiful streams. For the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses. You know, there is nothing new invention, there is nothing real coming out of the poet. Poet is not able to compose until he is inspired and until he is out of his senses. Now, think of Wordsworth, for example. You must have studied Wordsworth's poem Daffodils. So, how did he come to write Daffodils? You know, when he was in a sort of awakened state, he was just lying on a couch, and the flesh, the sight of the daffodils flowers flashed upon his inward eye. So, you know, it came to him as in a dreamy state. He suddenly recollected. So, when the poet loses the realistic ground, when the poet loses the consciousness about himself and the world around, only then he can create something. And Plato strictly, strongly disapproves a poet losing the consciousness or the control over himself. So for the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he is inspired and out of his senses. And the mind is no longer in him when he has not attained to this state. He is powerless and unable to utter his oracle. Until he has attained that different state of mind, he is powerless. Unless he is inspired, he cannot write poetry, right? So this is a very, very crucial quotation from his work Ion, which makes his theory of imitation open to us. Let us go further in our discussion. Philosophy, according to Plato, philosophy is better than poetry because philosopher deals with idea or truth, whereas poet deals with what appears to him or illusion. The reality and the appearance may be different. So poets go by the illusion, philosophers adhere to the fact. And he believed that truth of philosophy was more important than the pleasure of poetry. He did not give importance to aesthetic pleasure. He did not give importance to emotional enjoyment, emotional outburst, but he gave importance to philosophical truth, that which can be experienced and that which can be practiced in life. That was important for Plato. Further, Plato's chief interest was philosophical investigations, which formed the subject of his great works in the form of dialogues. So he does not give an aesthetic touch or imaginative touch to poetry or other artworks. He is mainly concerned with this particular subject looked upon philosophically. He was not a professed critic of literature. He was not a professed critic of literature, and his critical observations are not found in any single book. Uh, Earlier we discussed that his chief interest was philosophical investigation. He was not concerned with the aesthetic, imaginative, or emotive aspects of art. And this is what he discusses in his work Dialogues. And Plato was, as such, not a pure critic of literature as we have other critics. But Plato had more a philosophical viewpoint to study literature, and his ideas about what the poet should be, what should be his qualities, how he should write poetry, all these things, they are not discussed in one particular book, but his ideas are scattered in 7 different dialogues, and particularly in the Ion, the Symposium, the Republic, and the Laws. Now, I explained you with the example of flower, that how poetry, painting, they are removed from reality. Art is twice removed from reality. That's why it is an illusion. So, talking about this particular point, Plato says, according to him, all arts are imitative or mimetic in nature, but we shall avoid the word mimetic here. We will use the word imitative. So according to Plato, all arts are imitative in nature. And he writes in the Republic that ideas are the ultimate reality. Things are conceived as the ideas before they take practical shapes. So idea is original and the thing is the copy of the idea. We discussed in our introduction Plato's idealism or Plato's realism, wherein he gives importance to the idea of universal or abstract objects existing outside the human mind. The human mind in an inspired state receives it from somewhere in the universe and then colors it with imagination and emotion and so on and so forth, right? So Plato gives prominence to the real idea, R capital, real idea existing outside the human mind. And the things are conceived as ideas before they take practical shapes. So human mind first conceives that idea, perceives that idea, and then the human mind in different ways works on that idea to give it a practical shape. A painter first stores the idea in his mind, receives the idea in his mind, and then starts thinking how he can demonstrate this idea, how he can manifest this idea through his painting. Say poet, then he thinks how he can demonstrate the idea through words, right? So medium are different, but they perceive the things in a different way, and how the thing is perceived on the basis of the idea which exists in the universe. I hope you are clear till now. And he gives the example of carpenter's chair, which is the result of the idea of chair in the mind. Carpenter, how can a carpenter make a chair without having the idea? It is always the idea that comes first. So, you know, carpenter has something in his mind, that an object which has the straight surface, an object that has four legs on which that surface can be placed, and one object at the back adhering to the lower surface, so that one can sit on the basis of the four legs and can also rest. So this sort of idea carpenter receives, his carpenter's mind receives, and then by his technical skills, carpenter starts working on the idea, and the chair is the physical manifestation of the idea that was there in the carpenter's mind. Okay. Then comes the painter. What does the painter do? Painter looks at the painting of the chair. When he looks at the painting, painter looks at the chair made by the carpenter. Now for the painter, that is the real chair. What carpenter made on the basis of the idea and the physical manifestation, the very chair, the wooden chair, it is once removed from reality, because he has copied the idea which was there in his mind. Now comes the painter. What does the painter do? Painter looks at that wooden chair, observes the wooden chair properly, and then, you know, starts making a drawing on a canvas. Four legs, the surface, another object to which one can rest his or her back. So the painting is ready. Now, that painting of chair is a copy of carpenter's wooden chair. Carpenter's wooden chair is again a copy of the idea which was somewhere. So the painting of the chair is twice removed from reality. And lastly comes the poet. He keeps the poet on a third place, Plato. So then comes the poet. What does the poet do? Poet observes the painting. He looks at the size, the shape, the color of the chair, and he pours his emotions. He adds his emotions to that and writes a poem on a piece of paper. So what happens when a poet comes to write poetry? What he has done? He has copied the painting of a chair. The painting of a chair was a copy of wooden chair. Wooden chair was a copy of the idea of chair that existed somewhere, and carpenter adopted the idea. Okay, so the real idea of chair, carpenter's wooden chair, the painting of the chair, and the poem on the chair. So poem on the chair is thrice removed from reality. Before that, you have carpenter's chair and painted chair. So poet is thrice removed from reality. He is the most illusionary person according to Plato, right? So, you know, you can say that he keeps the poets and artists in the last category. Though, as I said, ironically, Plato himself was a poet. Thus, the chair is once removed from reality, but painter's chair is an imitation of carpenter's chair, so it is twice removed. And the artist or the poet takes man away from reality rather than towards it. Artist work, depending on the painter's work, becomes thrice removed from reality. So artists always deal in illusion. This is a very, very important point in the theory of Plato's theory of imitation. So this idea must be clear to you. Thrice removed from reality, poets are thrice removed from reality, right? And through the example of chair, in the exam also, you have to write the example of chair, which is given by Plato. Okay, now Plato's three main objections. He rejects poetry on three grounds. Which are these three grounds on the basis of which Plato rejects poetry? First, he says they are not ethical, moral. Earlier also we discussed that he finds poems as immoral. He finds poets as immoral. Another, he does not find poetry philosophical. And third, he does not find poetry pragmatic or practical, right? So he objected to poetry from the point of view of education, that is moral. From the philosophical point of view, they are not based on the universal truth, established fact. And third, from moral or practical point of view. To go further in our discussion, so this we discussed that Plato has three main objections: moral, philosophical, and pragmatic. Then, why does he object? And that to object on three grounds, very serious a critic. He says it is not philosophical, it is not ethical, because it promotes undesirable passion. Undesirable passion. In the chapter, if you have read, then he says that even great Greek poets like Homer and Hesiod, they all mispresent gods. Undue emotions, unnecessary passion are given to them. How they mispresent gods and what false picture the poets create, that all we shall read. But first, let's just discuss this particular point, the three objections, and why three objections. Poetry is not ethical because it promotes undesirable passions. Then it is not philosophical because it does not provide true knowledge of life. And it is not pragmatic because it is inferior to the practical arts and there is no education value. According to Plato, there is no educational perspective in the poetry, in the art. And on your page 39 in your chapter, Plato says that, I'm reading the first para on page 39, he says, Plato is interested in literature or art only insofar as it influences beneficial in molding the life of the good citizens. Any art, it has to be life changing. It has to aim it at the betterment of society. It has to correct the morals of the citizens. If poetry fulfills this function, then he allows this poetry or such art forms in his ideal state. Now, this ideal state, I capital S capital, and ideal citizen, I capital C capital, that also we need to understand here. Plato said that in his ideal state, any state, or Gujarat is a state, the place where he lives, the country to which he belongs, ideal state. Okay, he says that his state has to be ideal in the sense, no falsehood, no over emotions, no false imagination would be entertained, and absolutely moralist, philosophical, realistic people, artists would have place in the ideal state. And those who are following morals, those who adhere to the established fact, those who are whose ethics are correct, uh, they all will be called ideal citizens. That's why he writes here that his only intention is to mold the life of the citizens as good. None other is to be allowed to contaminate his state. No one else will be allowed in his ideal state. Those who do not follow philosophical, moral, and educational ground, they are absolutely outrightly rejected from his ideal state. Then, if we mean our future guardians to regard the habit of quarreling among themselves as of all things the basest, no word should be said to them of the wars in the heaven or of the plots and fighting of the gods against one another, for they are not true. Now, here again on page 39, Plato, quoting the classical Greek poets like Homer and Hesiod, says that can the guardians of the state, these great poets, they are the guardians of the state. I said in the beginning that poets have a moral duty to perform. They are not only to just provide pleasure, they have a moral responsibility on them. They are to correct the society. That's why Plato calls them guardian of the state. So he says, can the guardian of the state allow the poets to misrepresent the gods and show them as revengeful or lustful or cruel or waging war among themselves? There are Greek classics, Greek tragedies, Greek epics, wherein even the gods are shown as fighting with themselves. Even gods are shown as cruel, being harsh to other gods or being harsh to humankind. They are also shown as lustful. They also enjoy the sensuousness. So he says that how can the poet present God as lustful, revengeful, cruel? It spoils the society. If ordinary human beings, they read such stories where even the God is fighting, then what will the mankind learn? They would learn the same thing, fighting, being lustful, being cruel. They would not learn good morals, correct? Can they allow God, who is good, to be described as the author of evil? Can the God do something evil? Can they permit the gods to be shown as assuming fictitious shapes or telling paltry lies or in any way demeaning themselves? How can God present a lie? How can a God speak the truth? How can God have fictitious shapes? In our Indian gods, they all have different shapes, and Mataji ko has 9 hands and whatnot, right? So Plato rejects all these. This is, all illusionary. This is our own imagination, all our makeup of God. God is actually not like that. This is not a real concept of God. That is the reason that Plato rejects all these things. Let us go further in our presentation. So I hope you are clear with this particular quotation. No word should be said to them of the wars in the heaven or plots and fighting of the gods against one another, for they are not true, right? Ordinary people should not hear such stories. And if they would only believe, as we would tell them, that quarreling is unholy, and that never up to this time has there been any quarreling between citizens, these tales of epics must not be admitted into our state, whether they are supposed to have allegorical meaning or not. So no stories of fighting, no stories of cruelty, no stories in which there is a misrepresentation of God is allowed in his ideal state. And when certain things are prohibited in the ideal state, only then there can be ideal citizens in the ideal state. So he objected on the ground that poetry does not cultivate good habits among children. The imitator or maker of the image knows nothing of true existence. He knows the appearance only, The poet is an imitator, painter is an imitator. So he doesn't know the reality, R capital. He only knows the appearance, and appearance can be illusionary. Appearance can be false also. So imitative art, whether it is painting, whether it is poetry, even carpentry, all that is always inferior. And who Plato, goes to the extreme, and he says the one who marries an inferior has inferior offspring. Plato felt that poetry, like all forms of art, appeals to the inferior part of the soul, the irrational, emotional, cowardly part. The reader of poetry is seduced into feeling undesirable emotions. Poetry is the subject of imagination. The poetry is a subject of emotion. So it does not elevate your soul. It does not make you feel sublime. It does not purify your imagination, but rather makes you unnecessarily feel over emotional, over sensitive, make you succumb to undue passions and all. And that is why it has no rational in it. It has no logic in it. That is what Plato says. To Plato, an appreciation of poetry is incompatible with an appreciation of reason, justice, and the search for truth. When there is reasoning in it, when there is justice in it, and when there is search for truth, T capital, universal truth, only then poetry can be appreciated. In the Ion, he suggests that poetry causes needless lamentation and ecstasy, that the imaginary events of sorrow and happiness that I slightly discussed with reference to the mispresentation of gods, and even in ordinary Greek tragedies, how the heroes are shown as vengeful, revengeful, so on and so forth. So it either leads to extreme state of sorrow, or comedies, then foolish acts, they lead you to foolish laughter or temporary happiness. So all these Plato finds absolutely meaningless, and it encourages nothing but the weaker part of the soul and baser impulses. It doesn't appeal to the higher faculty of mind, and it does not certainly refine your heart. And hence poetry has no healthy function. It cannot be called good. And drama, Plato finds drama even the most dangerous form. Now his student Aristotle gives importance to drama form. Aristotle has laid down his entire theory on the form tragedy. But Plato, the teacher, entirely rejects drama. He also had objections to poetry and drama also, because the author is imitating things that he or she does not understand. Plato seemingly feels that no words are strong enough to condemn drama. So drama is the meanest, the cheapest kind of form ever. And he thinks that it is such a cheap form, such a mean form, that he even does not have words to condemn the dramatic art. So he felt that all the world's evils derive from one source, that is faulty understanding of reality. When the reality is not conceived properly, understood well, it can lead to moral and philosophical degradation of human beings, and it can stop them from receiving good education to refine their manners, so on and so forth. Right? So that was Plato discussing his views on poetry with reference to his theory of imitation. Major 2 points are our concern. What is imitation for him? How does he develop his theory of imitation with reference to the real idea which exists outside the human mind? Then, with the example of the chair, carpenter's chair, once removed from reality, painter's painting of a chair, twice removed from reality, and poet's poem on chair, thrice removed from reality. Okay, that is our first standpoint. Then his objections to poetry, he rejects poetry on three grounds: moral, philosophical, and educational. Right? So, in which point, which problems he finds moral ground, then why does he object to that? Or how does he object to that? Philosophical ground, how does he object? Educational ground, how does he object? Then you have to clarify the concept of ideal state and ideal citizen. What is ideal state? What is ideal citizen? Which kinds of citizens are called ideal? And those citizens who can or who are allowed to live in the ideal state. All right. Then he justifies all this with the example of Homer and Hesiod, great Greek classical poets, epic poets, and how they mispresent gods, and that's why their literature even is banished from Plato's ideal state. All right. So this 4 5 core points you have to remember when you discuss Plato's views on poet and poetry. Now at the end, I have one short video of Dr. Sanjay Mukherjee, who was the former head of English department of Saurashtra University, currently the associate professor, and he is interviewed by Dr. Dilip Barar, who is the head in Bhavnagar University. All right, so let us watch that video on Plato's theory of imitation.
So Dr. Sanjay Mukherjee, I read in Plato's theory of mimesis that he has levied some serious charges on poets and poetry. Would you please elaborate a bit on these charges? Yeah, you know, Dr. Bharat, in the So Dr. Sanjay Mukherjee, I read in Plato's theory of mimesis that he has levied some serious charges on poets and poetry. Would you please elaborate a bit on these charges? Yeah, you know, Dr. Bharat, in the 1930s, mid-1930s, there was a philosopher called A.N. Whitehead, who had said that all subsequent Western philosophy, they are footnotes, as a footnotes to Plato. Now, therefore, the charges that Plato levies against poets and poetry, it also seems that in the Western critical context, we must begin with Plato's charges. Significantly, so we must, look at what are these charges, exactly, what these charges are. First of all, these charges are like poetry, he says, is inspirational and not rational, okay? Which means that poets create in a state of frenzy, which is not a very good state of mind, according to Plato. And therefore, this frenzy is wholly outside reason, okay? Outside reason. And it leads to the arousal of emotions, which is inappropriate, which is ethically not right, morally not right, and it includes certain wrongs. For example, certain harmful depiction, that like gods are depicted in a certain derogatory manner, which does not really inspire the devotees of the gods, and of course, in his famous text Iron, he would also say there are other inappropriacies. For example, does a charioteer, that is, know better about how to run a chariot, or does a poet know better about it? So, and he concludes that obviously the poet is not the proper person who can disseminate this kind of a knowledge. And therefore, it is then dangerous to follow poets who then spread such inaccuracies, and thereby they corrupt the soul of the people. Can now come to therefore what Plato thinks about poets. And what kind of inappropriate actions or inappropriate consequences arise from the poets. Okay, and for example, they are imitators, they are mere copiers, and therefore it's not right. They are, as we have already mentioned, they are immoral. Poets are immoral because they further immoral depictions, immoral representations. Poets are possessed. They work in a sense in stance, in frenzy. That is also not proper. What is more, that this frenzy, it seems to pass on to the viewers, readers, listeners, which is very harmful. And this should not happen, and they are liars, according to Plato. Poets are liars because of two primary reasons. One is that, and he was shocked at it, Plato was quite shocked. One is that the gods are represented in a very false manner. Gods should remain as gods, better than human beings. But they are represented as like human beings, or sometimes lesser than human beings, or evil human beings. So that is one aspect. And secondly, he believes his ultimate real world is an unchanging world. He was shocked that how can human beings depict a certain world which is like the mortal world, a changing world. Human agency actually has no control over that ultimate reality. And that was, poets do that. Poets bring about a change in the unchanging world through their depiction. And this was absolutely unpardonable for Plato. Thank you. Thank you.
So that is all about our second chapter in CC 12, Plato's views on poet and poetry. Please read the chapter, follow the video lecture, and in our next session, we shall talk about Aristotle's views on imitation, his reply to his teacher, Plato. Till then, keep studying. Bye-bye.